positive outcome between peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And when President Obama came to power, the first thing that he promised to do was to reverse previous President Bush's absolutely appalling work in this process. You probably don't remember, but 8 years ago when President Bush came to power, he actually had a completely different view of this conflict than every other president who would come before him. President Bush's point was, this isn't really our problem. This is a problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they should work it out on their own. And so essentially what Bush did was just kind of wipe his hands clean of the entire mess. Now, let's be honest for a moment. First of all, Bush didn't really wipe his hands clean. As a matter of fact, he had a very simple policy for 8 years. That policy was Israel can do whatever it wants to do, whenever it wants to do it, to whomever it wants to do it. It's a very simple policy on Bush's part. Israel, right or wrong, that was Bush's policy for 8 years. Part of that policy, however, was this notion that, hey, this is a peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, so let's have the Israelis and the Palestinians deal with it. Right? Except that this is not actually two equal groups. It's not as though the Israelis and the Palestinians are equal partners. It's not as though they're sitting at the table, with equal power. One, Israel, is first of all a state, a nation state. It's also the richest nation in the Middle East. It's also the most powerful nation in the Middle East. It has the largest army. It has a weapon system that's almost equal to the United States weapon system. Why? Because it's our weapons. And also, it's not a third world country. In fact, the per capita income, in other words, per person income in Israel is larger than the combined per person income of every other country in the Middle East combined. So you're talking about a first world country, not a third world country, a powerful, wealthy, democratic first world country. On the other side, you have a non-state. There's no Palestine. There's no Palestinian government. There's sort of a provisional, a nominal head, the Palestinian Authority, as it's referred to, which is essentially, the political voice of the Palestinians, but they have no recognition. It's not like they have a seat at the UN. They don't get to vote for anything. And certainly, so that's politically speaking. Certainly economically speaking, what remains of Palestine is one of the poorest places on earth. The West Bank is doing a little bit better, but the Gaza Strip, remember that little strip of land in the Gaza, is one of the poorest, most miserable places on earth. It is, to this day, the most densely packed region on the planet. 1.5 million people in a space that is little more than just a gigantic prison. No food gets in, no food gets out. It has maybe a couple of hours of electricity a day, no real sense of any kind of potable water. Everything that it uses to survive is brought in by Israel through that little thing. And I told you, I gave you the metaphor of saying, because again, Gaza is no longer directly occupied territory. About 3 or 4 years ago, the Israelis decided to withdraw from Gaza, so they don't really call it occupied territory anymore. But we've talked about this, right? It's a silly distinction. If you're occupying this classroom, and then you walk out of the classroom and just go to the doors, you're still occupying us, even though you're not in the actual room. You basically become, prison wardens. That's really what you've become. So to think that these two sides can sit down at a table by themselves without an intermediary and hash out a peace plan is ridiculous. It's absurd. It's like, the difference between it's like a parent and a child negotiating something. There's no negotiation. Whatever the parent wants, the parent gets. The parent is the bigger, the stronger, the more powerful. The parent pays the bills. If the parent says no, it's no. There's nothing to talk about. Unless, of course, there is sort of a mediator there, a third group, a third person who can actually deal with two sides in some sort of equal fashion. And for most of the last 40 years or so, that intermediary was the United States, except for the Bush administration, during the 8 years of the Bush administration. When President Obama came to office, he decided that he was going to do things differently. In fact, he made a number of grand promises that, unlike previous administrations, his was going to be the first administration that was going to really roll up its sleeves, get its hands dirty, get these two sides together, force each of them to sacrifice, to make compromises, and to bring a peace process to the table once and for all, to create a two-state solution, which, of course, remember, all the way back to UN 242 is the standard peace process here, which everybody knows and everybody agrees to. What is that? Number one, we talked about it already, but I'll just remind you one more time. Number one, two states. An Israel and a Palestine living side by side with each other. Number two, Jerusalem split between the two. So what's often referred to as West Jerusalem, which is really like 80% of Jerusalem, becomes the capital of Israel. And East Jerusalem, which is about 20% of Jerusalem, becomes the capital of Palestine. And third is the issue of the right of return, remember? Oh wait, actually, hold on, sorry, my mistake. That's fourth. There is a more important third. And that is that Israel withdraws through 1967 borders. What happened in 1967? That was the Six-Day War, remember, in which Israel became the occupying power over the West Bank and over Gaza. And then the fourth is that this issue of right of return. This is something that you've read about a lot already. You'll be hearing a lot more about it in the film. This notion that, hey, 500,000 Palestinians, people who actually lived in this land, who have lost their homes, who were kicked out of this land, they would say they were kicked out, forced out by Israel. Israel says, no, they left voluntarily in the middle of a war. Regardless, they lost their land, they lost their homes, they lost their property, and they have been living on the outskirts of Israel-Palestine in refugee camps in Syria, refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, some in Egypt, for 40 years. 40 years waiting to go back home. But of course there is no home for them anymore. Their lands have all been seized by Israelis. Their homes now have Jews living in them. They don't have their fields anymore. They don't have their businesses anymore. Somehow these people have to be compensated. Now, what the Palestinians want is for them to be able to come back. But of course, we know that that's impossible. I mean, at the time, 40 years ago, they were barely 1 million people. 40 years later, they're now more than 5 million people. You can't just have 5 million people all of a sudden come back. It would completely destroy